6:00 a.m., September 5th, 2025. Inside the maximum security wing of Utah State Prison, a quiet knock echoes down the corridor. Guards open a steel door and deliver a meal to inmate Ralph Menzies, who's been on death row for nearly 4 decades. The tray holds his last meal, a deeply personal request not yet disclosed to the public. It's his final choice in a world where all freedom has been stripped away. He has only 24 hours left to live. The room is stark. One bed, one sink, one toilet. A clock ticks quietly on the wall, each second heavier than the last. A chaplain is scheduled to arrive soon. Menzies will also be given the chance to write final letters, make last phone calls, and spend time with a spiritual advisor or a legal representative. He will be monitored by officers and medical staff for any signs of psychological distress. This routine has been rehearsed before twice, in fact, only for the execution to be stayed at the last minute. But this time, the clock is real. Ralph Menzies is Utah's longest-serving death row inmate. Convicted in 1988 for the brutal kidnapping and murder of 26-year-old Moren Hunaker, he spent more than half his life confined in a cell, awaiting the justice that the victim's family feared might never come. His case has been delayed by dozens of legal challenges, appeals, competency evaluations, and procedural reviews, 39 years of legal limbo where the end never seemed to arrive. But today it does. At approximately 6:00 a.m. on September 5th, the prison kitchen prepares Menzies' requested last meal. Inmates on death row are typically allowed to select a final meal within budget and availability, though some states have limited options after previous abuses of the tradition. Psychologists say these meals often reflect a desire for comfort, control, or nostalgia. Sometimes they say more than the inmate's final words ever could. While the contents of Menzies' meal haven't been disclosed, the act of choosing it is itself revealing. After decades of isolation, does he reach back to a childhood dish, a fast food craving, or perhaps he asks for nothing at all? Silence can speak louder than words, and after nearly 40 years of silence, the world is listening. At 7:00 p.m., Menzies will be blindfolded and strapped into a chair inside Utah's execution chamber. 5 marksmen, chosen from law enforcement, will stand behind a curtain. 4 rifles will be loaded with live ammunition. 1 will be loaded with a blank round. None of them will know who fired the fatal shot. That moment, now just hours away, has been awaited by one family in particular, the Hunakers. For decades, Moren's son Matt has spoken publicly about the pain of losing his mother, who was taken from him when he was just 10 years old. His grandmother, Moren's mother, passed away in 2021 without ever seeing justice. The grief has rippled across generations. But before we reach that final hour, we need to understand who Ralph Menzies really is, and how a troubled boy from a broken home became one of Utah's most notorious criminals. We need to understand who Moren Hunaker was, the young wife working a night shift at a small-town gas station just trying to help her family get ahead. This is not just a story about death. It's a story about time, time lost. Time stolen, time withheld. And whether after nearly 4 decades justice delayed is still justice served, before the final meal, before the execution chamber, before the prison walls closed in around Ralph Menzies for good. There were 2 people. 2 lives that started worlds apart and would one day collide in the most devastating way imaginable. Let's begin with Moren Hunaker. She was born on February 28, 1959, in a quiet corner of Utah. At 26, she had recently married Jim Hunaker, the love of her life. The two were building something together, a modest but stable home. Moren was known as soft-spoken, thoughtful, and devoted. Even during tough times, she kept things steady. She picked up a second job, working evening shifts at a gas station in Karns, hoping to help pay the bills and start a family. Every night, like clockwork, she'd call Jim after her shift. It wasn't just habit, it was love. It was their ritual, their connection. But on the night of February 23, 1986, that phone call never came. And that silence would be the beginning of a nightmare no family should ever endure. Now, let's go back even further. To April 21, 1958. That's the day Ralph Leroy Menzies was born. Unlike Moren, Ralph never knew a life of stability or safety. His early years were marked by chaos, neglect, and violence. He was passed between unstable homes, repeatedly abused by the adults who were supposed to protect him. His stepfathers were known for their cruelty, locking Ralph and his sister in a tiny room for days at a time, often without food. School for him wasn't a place of learning. It was an escape when he was even allowed to go. By the time Ralph was a teenager, he was already on a destructive path. And as he entered adulthood, crime became a way of survival. At just 18, he was convicted of aggravated robbery. It wouldn't be his last arrest, far from it. Some experts would later argue that Ralph's early trauma shaped his future, that a system failed to intervene when it mattered most. But others believe those same experiences don't excuse what he eventually became. Because trauma isn't a free pass, especially not when lives are destroyed in its wake, and one of those lives was Moren's. Back in 1986, Jim Hunaker was expecting his wife to call around 10:30 p.m. When the phone never rang, he grew concerned. He called the gas station, no answer. When he drove there himself, he found the store abandoned. Moren's purse and the register's cash were missing. The scene was off, but there were no immediate signs of violence. Not yet. Then, just after 11:00 p.m., the phone rang. It was Moren. Her voice was trembling. She told Jim she'd been taken by someone who wanted money, but she believed he'd let her go. Before he could ask more, the line went dead. That would be the last time anyone ever heard her voice. What followed would unravel piece by piece. Witnesses, a car, a knife, and eventually a name, Ralph Menzies. He had been released on bail just 3 days before Moren vanished, following yet another arrest. And as investigators would soon learn, his freedom came at a terrible cost. Two people, one trying to build a future, the other trying to outrun his past. Their paths crossed for one tragic moment in time, and nothing would ever be the same again. It was a chilly Sunday evening, February 23, 1986, in Karns, Utah. At the corner gas station, Moren Hunaker clocked in for her usual shift. The lights overhead buzzed quietly. Outside, snow still clung to the curbside. Moren's job was routine: take payments, pump gas, help customers. Nothing ever happened here, except that night something did. Around 10:15 p.m. A man pulled into the station driving a cream-colored 1974 Chevrolet. He wore dark clothes, had curly black hair, a thick beard, and eyes that didn't blink often. His name, Ralph Leroy Menzies. Unknown to Moren and the public, Menzies had been released on bail just 3 days earlier, following a charge of attempted theft. He had no job, no plan, and according to later court records, no intention of staying out of trouble. But this time, he wasn't just looking to steal. He brought a hunting knife with him. And according to investigators, he came to that gas station with a purpose. What happened next would only become clear through fragments, testimony, surveillance gaps, physical evidence. But one thing is certain: Moren didn't leave that station willingly. At 10:45 p.m., a call came through to her husband, Jim. It was Moren, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. She said she'd been taken by a man who wanted money, but assured Jim that she would be released soon. Before he could ask where she was or who had her, the line went dead. Jim drove straight to the station. No sign of Moren. Her purse was missing. The cash register was empty, just $16 gone. He called the police, but without signs of a struggle or witnesses, there was little to go on. Behind the scenes, Menzies was on the move. According to his later confession, he drove Moren into the mountains, Big Cottonwood Canyon to be exact. He claimed to have picked up his girlfriend at one point and drove around with both women before dropping his girlfriend off. At some point, though, Moren stopped being a passenger and became a hostage. Later testimony suggested that Menzies may have tied her to a tree in the wooded canyon overnight. When her body was discovered, investigators found scuffed bark, consistent with someone being restrained. There were marks on her wrists, evidence that she had been bound. On February 25th, 2 days after her disappearance, a hiker found Moren's body near the Storm Mountain picnic area. The scene was quiet, peaceful even, but what investigators found was devastating. Moren had died from ligature strangulation, and there was also a knife wound to her neck. Though clean language prevents us from describing that detail further, court documents confirmed it as part of the cause of death. Her family had spent 48 hours in a nightmare. Now it had come to an end, but not the kind they prayed for. The pieces started coming together quickly. Police had arrested Menzies the day after Moren disappeared on an unrelated burglary charge. He was already in jail when Moren's body was discovered. But that didn't stop the evidence from catching up to him. In the laundry room used by inmates, a guard found 4 of Moren's ID cards in Menzies' clothing. At his apartment, police discovered her purse, along with a knife capable of inflicting the wound seen in the autopsy. They even matched fingerprints in the borrowed Chevrolet to Moren. But the most damning piece of all, a jailhouse confession. Menzies reportedly told a fellow inmate that taking Moren's life gave him a thrill he couldn't describe. That statement would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, and one that left the courtroom silent when read aloud. No one could change what had happened, but at last the truth was beginning to take shape. A young woman had vanished during an ordinary shift at a gas station, and her final hours spent in fear and isolation were now part of a much bigger story. And Ralph Menzies, he was about to face charges that could bring the ultimate penalty. As news of Moren Hunaker's death spread through the quiet communities of Utah, law enforcement moved swiftly. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was a homicide, and they already had a suspect in custody. Ralph Menzies, just 27 years old, was sitting in jail on an unrelated burglary charge when officers learned that a hiker had discovered Moren's body in Big Cottonwood Canyon. The timeline matched. The geography matched. But police needed more than a coincidence. They needed proof, and it didn't take long to find it. During a routine check of the jail's laundry room, a guard uncovered something strange. A bundle of clothing belonging to Menzies, and inside, 4 identification cards belonging to Moren Hunaker. These weren't just traces, they were direct links to the victim, found in a place where only inmates had access. Detectives searched Menzies' apartment next. Inside, they found Moren's purse and a portion of the missing cash from the gas station. But even more disturbing was the discovery of a hunting knife, the same kind that experts later confirmed could have inflicted the wounds seen in Moren's autopsy. At this point, investigators had physical evidence connecting Menzies to the scene, the victim, and the crime. But they also needed to understand the full picture, what happened, when, and why. So they began speaking to witnesses. 2 teenagers, Tim Larrabee and Bate Brown, had been hiking near Storm Mountain on the morning of February 24th, just hours after Moren was last seen. They described seeing a man and woman who matched the descriptions of Menzies and Moren. The man had curly black hair, a beard, and was about 6 feet tall, consistent with Menzies' profile. The car they described, a cream-colored 1974 Chevrolet borrowed by Menzies from his friend Troy Denter. Police examined the vehicle and found Moren's fingerprints inside. That was no coincidence. It was confirmation. Still, the most powerful piece of evidence didn't come from fingerprints, knives, or car doors. It came from Menzies himself. While in jail, Menzies reportedly confided in a fellow inmate named Walter Britton. In a chilling exchange, Menzies allegedly admitted to killing Moren Hunaker, and even said that the act of taking her life brought him an intense thrill. Britton later contacted authorities and gave a formal statement under oath. According to prosecutors, this wasn't just a confession, It was insight into Menzies' mindset. It showed not just guilt, but a disturbing lack of remorse. As the pieces came together, more evidence emerged. The father of Menzies' girlfriend found Moren's social security card in his daughter's belongings. She claimed Menzies had given it to her but didn't explain why. Investigators now had a growing list of physical and testimonial proof linking Menzies directly to the victim. Despite the strength of the evidence, this case wasn't easy. In 1986, Utah law enforcement didn't have access to the modern DNA databases we rely on today. There were no security cameras at the gas station, no digital trails. The investigation relied heavily on eyewitness testimony, fingerprints, and physical connections between suspect and victim. But sometimes that's enough. And in this case, it was more than enough. By early 1987, the Salt Lake County District Attorney was ready to press charges: first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. They would seek the death penalty, arguing that Menzies had planned the crime in advance and acted with extreme cruelty. But Menzies still had defenders. Some pointed to his traumatic childhood, the abuse, the system that failed him. They argued that he was a product of his past and that life in prison was punishment enough. But for Moren Hunaker's family, none of that could erase the call they would never forget, the sound of her voice, frightened and fading. A voice that said she'd be released soon. A voice that never came home. And so, the case moved to trial. A long road lay ahead, but for the first time, the wheels of justice were turning. By the time Ralph Menzies was formally charged, the case had already captured public attention. The evidence was strong. The timeline was clear. The pain in Moren Hunaker's family was undeniable. But now it was time for a courtroom to decide. The trial began on February 18, 1988, in Salt Lake County. Menzies stood accused of aggravated murder and kidnapping, both under circumstances that allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty. From day one, the courtroom was tense. The prosecution came prepared with everything they had: 4 of Moren's ID cards found in the jail's laundry, stuffed in clothing worn by Menzies. Her purse and stolen cash found in his apartment. A hunting knife that matched the wounds from the autopsy. Her fingerprints found in the Chevrolet he had borrowed. And perhaps most damaging, the jailhouse confession, Menzies allegedly telling another inmate that ending Moren's life gave him a thrill. To the jury, this wasn't just a case of murder. It was a case of intent, brutality, and cold calculation. Prosecutors argued that Menzies didn't just commit a robbery gone wrong. He brought the weapon with him, planned to use it, and carried out the killing with chilling indifference. They painted a picture of a man who had spent years in and out of prison, given chances, released on bail, and who still chose violence. They showed the jury his history: robbery, escape from prison, violent offenses, and a complete lack of rehabilitation. But the defense took a different route. They didn't deny that Menzies was responsible. Instead, they focused on why. His attorneys detailed his traumatic upbringing, a childhood filled with abuse, neglect, and abandonment. They described how he was beaten by stepfathers, locked in small rooms, denied food and education. They called psychological experts to explain how long-term trauma can warp a person's behavior, stunt emotional growth, and even alter decision-making in extreme ways. Their argument wasn't about innocence. It was about mercy. They asked the jury to consider second-degree murder, a lesser charge that would carry a life sentence without parole but spare Menzies from execution. They argued that Ralph Menzies was not a monster by choice, but by circumstance, and that his life, though broken, still held some value. The jury listened carefully. And yet, the evidence told a story of a woman, 26 years old, taken from her job, tied up, held overnight in the cold, and killed in a remote canyon. The call to her husband, the fear in her voice. The life she never got to finish, the son she never saw grow up. In the eyes of the jury, this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crime that demanded accountability at the highest level. On March 8, 1988, after weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. But the decision about his sentence, whether he would live or die, wasn't up to the jury. Menzies waived his right to have the jury decide, placing that responsibility solely in the hands of the presiding judge, Raymond Uno. At sentencing, Menzies' defense once again pleaded for leniency, citing his mental health, his childhood, and the possibility of spiritual rehabilitation. They argued that sentencing him to death would not undo the tragedy, it would only extend the cycle of loss. But the prosecution stood firm. They argued that Menzies had been given chance after chance, and each time he chose violence. That even after prison, parole, and probation, he returned to crime, and this time it ended in a life taken. They called his actions cold-blooded and said his lack of remorse made rehabilitation unlikely. On March 23, 1988, Judge Uno delivered his ruling. For the crimes committed against Moren Hunaker and for the threat you pose to society. Well, the sentence is death. Ralph Menzies would later choose to be executed by firing squad, one of the few methods still allowed under Utah law at the time. His execution was scheduled for May 1988, but as the next chapter would show, that date would not be kept. Because what followed was not silence or closure. It was a long, winding road of appeals, delays, and questions that would span the next 39 years. When Judge Raymond Uno handed down the death sentence in March of 1988, many believed Ralph Menzies would be executed within the year. The evidence had been overwhelming, the crime deeply disturbing, and public support for the sentence was strong. But justice, especially when tied to capital punishment, rarely moves in a straight line. For the next 39 years, Ralph Menzies remained on death row, confined to a cell at Utah State Prison while his legal team filed appeal after appeal. Some cited procedural errors. Others challenged the validity of key testimony. And over time, new arguments emerged, ones that questioned his mental fitness to be executed at all. In 1992 and again in 1994, the Utah Supreme Court upheld Menzies' conviction and sentence. A death warrant was issued in 1995, scheduling his execution for June 2nd of that year. But just weeks before the date, his lawyers secured a stay of execution, arguing that further legal issues needed review. It was the first of many delays. Over the next 3 decades, Menzies would become a near-permanent resident of Utah's death row. His appeals were rejected in 1996, 2003, 2004, 2012, 2014, 2019, and again in 2022. Each time, the court stood by the original sentence. But with every new legal motion, the clock reset. Meanwhile, Moren Hunaker's family waited. Her son Matt, just 10 years old when his mother was killed, grew into adulthood with a constant shadow, knowing the man responsible was still alive, year after year filing petitions, avoiding the sentence he'd been given. His grandmother, Moren's mother, passed away in 2021 without ever seeing closure. In October 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear Menzies' final appeal. With all legal avenues exhausted, Utah prosecutors moved to schedule an execution. But another question soon took center stage. Was Menzies mentally competent to be executed? By this point, he was 67 years old and reportedly suffering from dementia. His defense team argued that he no longer fully understood the nature of his punishment and therefore could not legally be put to death under the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. A judge ordered a competency hearing, which took place in November 2024. State medical experts concluded that although Menzies showed some cognitive decline, he still understood why he was being executed and what the consequences were. In June 2025, the court ruled that Menzies was competent to face execution. A new death warrant was issued, setting the date for September 5, 2025. And so, after nearly 4 decades, the process began. On September 4th, Menzies entered Death Watch, a protocol that begins 24 hours before execution. He was moved to a special holding area, monitored around the clock. He was allowed to meet with family, make phone calls, and receive visits from attorneys and a spiritual advisor. He also had one last choice to make: his final meal. While the contents of that meal haven't been released to the public, it was served at 6:00 a.m. on execution day. Inmates often choose dishes that reflect comfort, childhood memories, or symbolic meaning. Some order large feasts, others nothing at all. Psychologists say the last meal is more than just food, it's a window into the inmate's state of mind. Is it nostalgia, defiance, acceptance, or simply hunger? For a man like Ralph Menzies, who had lived more years behind bars than in freedom, the meal may have been the last true decision he controlled. Before sunset, Menzies met with the warden and was prepared for the execution. According to Utah law, because he was sentenced before 2004, he was given a choice between lethal injection and firing squad. He chose firing squad, one of the few remaining inmates in modern U.S. history to do so. At 7:00 p.m., Menzies was strapped to a chair inside the execution chamber. He was blindfolded, his arms restrained, and a target placed over his heart. Behind a curtain, 5 trained marksmen raised their rifles, 4 with live rounds, 1 with a blank, so no one would know who fired the fatal shot. In the final moments, Menzies was asked if he had any last words. Some inmates use that moment to express remorse. Others offer a prayer, a message to their family, or a final act of defiance. As of this writing, what Menzies said or didn't say has not been made public. After nearly 40 years of delay, the final act was complete. But for Moren's family, the emotional journey was still far from over. On September 5, 2025, after nearly 4 decades, Ralph Menzies was executed by firing squad. The case was finally closed, but the pain never really ended. For Matt Hunaker, the execution wasn't a moment of celebration. It wasn't relief. It was quiet, still, a lifetime in the making. He was 10 years old when his mother, Moren, was taken from him. Now, at nearly 50, he stood as a grown man, watching the state carry out a sentence that had been delayed again and again for most of his life. He had become a father himself. And yet, a part of his own childhood had been frozen in time since 1986. His grandmother, Moren's mother, never lived to see justice. She passed away in 2021, her last wish unfulfilled. Some call it closure. Others call it too little, too late. But the questions remain. Why did it take 39 years? Why did a family have to endure endless hearings, court dates, appeals, reversals, and restarts before the original sentence was ever carried out? For Matt, the hardest part wasn't just waiting. It was not knowing if it would ever happen. Every appeal meant a reopening of old wounds. Every delay meant another anniversary passing with no resolution. Justice, when delayed too long, can feel like no justice at all. And yet, others asked a different question. Should Ralph Menzies have been executed at all? By the time his execution date arrived, Menzies was in his late 60s, suffering from dementia, and had spent the majority of his life in a cell no larger than a parking space. His defense team argued that he no longer understood the full weight of what was happening, that the man about to be executed was no longer the man who committed the crime. The courts disagreed, but the debate lingers. The Menzies case has since sparked legal and ethical conversations in Utah and beyond. Should there be a time limit on carrying out death sentences? What role does mental health play in capital punishment? And how do we balance the rights of the convicted with the pain of the victims' families? In 2025, Utah began reviewing its protocols for evaluating mental competency on death row, in part due to the high-profile nature of the Menzies case. Lawmakers and legal scholars questioned whether the current system was built more for delay than for justice. And while the execution may have closed one chapter, it opened another, one about the true cost of waiting. Because while the legal system moved slowly, life kept moving forward. Matt raised a family without a mother to lean on. Holidays passed without her voice. Each year that Moren wasn't there was a reminder of what had been taken, and of the fact that, for decades, the person responsible was still alive. And yet, Matt never lost his voice. He continued to speak out, to honor his mother's memory, and to push for accountability, not out of vengeance, but out of love. "My mom was just doing her job," he once said. "She deserved to come home, and if it took 39 years to get there, then so be it. But I wasn't going to let the world forget her name." Moren Hunaker was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a wife, a mother. She loved her family, worked hard, and made the call that night not for herself, but for the people waiting at home. And while her life was taken in an instant, the echo of her story continues to resonate through laws, through memories, and through a son who refused to let go. The case of Ralph Menzies leaves behind more than a legal file. It's a reminder that justice is not just about verdicts and sentences. It's about people, about time, about what we lose and how long we're forced to carry it. And now, with the sentence carried out, the question still lingers: was justice served? Or was it simply delayed until it lost all meaning? That's a question each of us must answer for ourselves.